You're standing in a marble corridor so long you can't see where it ends. The walls are inlaid with gold that catches torchlight like captured stars, and somewhere far ahead you hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. You're 12 years old. Your hands won't stop shaking. A woman whose face you've known your entire life is applying kohl to your eyelids with a steady hand. But you notice her fingers tremble when she thinks you're not looking. She hasn't spoken in an hour. The silence between you has weight, like something physical pressing down on your chest. When she finally steps back to examine her work, you barely recognize the face staring back from the polished bronze mirror. You look older. That was the point. Someone clears their throat at the doorway, and your mother's mask cracks for just a moment. Her eyes close, her breath catches, then she's still again. Tonight, she whispers, you will do exactly as you're told. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? It's still surreal to me that a story this dark, from so long ago, can reach people in every corner of the globe. Drop a comment with your country. The girl's name was Amastris, though the records that survive call her by a title, not a person. The year was 492 BCE. The place was Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the edges of India. Her father was Xerxes I, king of kings, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. A man who commanded armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and held the power of life and death over millions. Persian kingship wasn't just political, was theological. The Achaemenid rulers claimed direct descent from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism. Their blood wasn't merely royal, it was divine, which meant their desires weren't just whims, they were sacred. And when a god-king wanted something, questioning it wasn't heresy against a man. It was heresy against heaven itself. Xerxes had inherited this doctrine from his father, Darius the Great, who had codified the concept of kavarna davion, glorious the essence that legitimized royal authority. But Xerxes took it further. Where his father had used divinity to justify conquest and law, Xerxes used it to justify control over every living soul within his reach, including his own children, especially his daughters. The system was already in place when Xerxes took the throne in 486 BCE. Persian royal marriages had long involved uncles wedding nieces, brothers taking sisters as wives, anything to keep the divine bloodline concentrated. But there was a line even previous kings had hesitated to cross openly. Xerxes didn't hesitate. He formalized what had been whispered about in previous generations. He claimed his daughters not as political assets to be married off, but as his own concubines first. And the palace, the priesthood, the entire apparatus of imperial power bent itself into knots to justify it. Amastris grew up watching this happen to her older half-sisters. She saw them disappear from the women's quarters at a certain age, always after the same ritualized preparations. She noticed how they returned different, quieter, or sometimes louder in ways that felt forced, brittle. No one explained it to her directly. Children in the Persian court learned through observation. Through the careful silences of adults, through the way mothers held their daughters just a little tighter as they approached adolescence. By the time Amastris turned 12, she understood. Understanding didn't make it easier. The palace eunuchs who managed the harem were experts in a particular kind of preparation. They knew exactly how Xerxes preferred his daughters presented. There was a template, refined over years. First, the ritual bathwater heated to precise temperatures, scented with oils imported from Arabia and India. Servants scrubbed skin until it gleamed, then applied moisturizers that made flesh luminous in lamplight. Hair was arranged in styles that added years to a young face. Cosmetics were applied with surgical precision. Kohl to enlarge the eyes. Rouge to redden lips and cheeks, powders to highlight bone structure. Jewelry was selected not for beauty, but for effect: gold and carnelian pieces that drew attention to emerging curves that caught light when the body moved. Clothing was chosen for its transparency. Its cling, its ability to suggest rather than conceal. The psychological preparation was just as systematic. Daughters were coached on proper behavior, how to walk, how to lower their eyes at the right moment, then raise them again, how to smile in ways that projected eagerness rather than fear. They were reminded, over and over, that this was an honor. That proximity to divine power was a blessing. That their service upheld cosmic order. The message was clear. Your body exists to serve the king. Resistance isn't just forbidden, it's incomprehensible. How does one resist the will of a god? What's most chilling about Xerxes' system is that it wasn't impulsive. It was institutional. When a maestress was finally summoned that night, it happened according to protocols developed over years. A eunuch arrived at the women's quarters with a message. She had for hours to prepare. Her mother and the female servants went through the ritual with mechanical efficiency, everyone playing their assigned role in a performance that had been staged dozens of times before. The older women knew what was coming. The younger ones learned. And a maestress, shaking beneath layers of silk and gold, discovered that understanding something intellectually doesn't prepare you for its reality. The Greek historians who later documented Persian court life struggled to describe these practices. Herodotus, writing decades after Xerxes' death, included coded references that his Greek audience would have understood as deeply transgressive. Ctesias, a Greek physician who spent years at the Persian court, left fragmentary accounts that later chroniclers found too disturbing to copy in full. Even in an ancient world where women had few rights, where slavery and concubinage were normalized, what Xerxes did to his daughters stood out as monstrous. But within Persepolis, it was invisible. Not because it was hidden, everyone knew, because the entire system was designed to make it unremarkable. The daughters developed their own strategies for survival. Some dissociated completely, training themselves to mentally separate from their bodies during encounters with their father. They would fix their eyes on architectural details in his chambers, the intricate carvings on ceiling beams, the patterns in mosaic floors, and recite poetry silently, transporting themselves elsewhere while their physical form remained. Others convinced themselves they were willing participants, that reframing exploitation as duty gave them back some measure of agency. A few broke entirely. Palace records mention princesses who stopped eating, who refused to speak, who had to be moved to remote estates where their psychological collapse wouldn't be visible to the court. And then Xerxes found a new use for them. In 480 BCE, he launched his massive invasion of Greece, the campaign that would include Thermopylae, Salamis, and ultimately humiliating defeat. He brought several of his daughters with him. Officially, this was about maintaining royal comfort during a long campaign. The truth was more calculated. Xerxes had realized his traumatized daughters could become tools of military policy. The mechanism was elegant in its cruelty. Commanders who distinguished themselves in battle were rewarded with temporary access to royal princesses. A marriage that would create permanent political bonds Xerxes didn't want. Just access. A week, sometimes a month, with a young woman who carried divine blood. The message to the army was unmistakable. Perform exceptionally, and even the most forbidden pleasures might be yours. The message to the daughters was equally clear. Your value isn't even limited to your father's use. You can be loaned out, your currency. General Hydarnes, who led the Immortals at Thermopylae, received Princess Rhodogine as a reward for his unit's performance. She was 17, he was 53. The encounter took place in a specially prepared tent behind the Persian lines, furnished with luxuries to maintain the illusion of royal dignity. Rhodogine had been trained to smile, to express gratitude, to perform enthusiasm. What she felt, the shame, the dissociation, the knowledge that her own father had handed her to a stranger, as you might reward a dog with meat, existed in a space the system had no language for. The Greek campaign failed spectacularly. After the naval disaster at Salamis and the land defeat at Plataea, Xerxes returned to Persia, facing a legitimacy crisis. If kings were gods, How could mortals defeat them? His response was to tighten control over what he could still dominate. The abuse of his daughters, which had been somewhat sporadic during the military campaign, intensified. Palace eunuchs noted in the carefully coded language they used for sensitive matters that summons became more frequent, more unpredictable. The king was asserting power over bodies because he'd lost power over nations. Princess Artaint, 19 years old, had endured 7 years of this system when Xerxes decided to deploy her in his most twisted scheme yet. He arranged her marriage to Darius, his own eldest son and heir to the throne. But before the marriage was finalized, Xerxes claimed Artaint one final time a demonstration that even his son's future wife wasn't beyond his reach. Then he did something that shocked even the jaded Persian court. He demanded that Darius's wife, Artaint's new daughter-in-law, also submit to him. The message was absolute. Every woman in the royal family, regardless of her relationship to other men, belonged fundamentally to the king. The historical record preserves a fragment of what happened next, though the details are disputed. Herodotus claims that Xerxes became obsessed with his daughter-in-law Artaint, to the point where his wife, Queen Amastris, finally acted. Not out of morality, she'd tolerated her husband's abuse of their daughters for decades, but out of political calculation. The king's behavior was becoming so erratic, it threatened dynastic stability. What followed was a palace purge so brutal it made Xerxes' sexual exploitation look almost mundane by comparison. The daughters who survived carried their trauma into marriages with Persian nobles, spreading dysfunction through the aristocracy like a contagion. Princess Mandane, married off to a satrap in Bactria, proved incapable of normal intimacy. Her children grew up in a household marked by her sudden rages and long silences, her inability to trust, her nightmares. Princess Datara, sent to a noble family in Susa, developed such severe anxiety that she required constant attendance by physicians. Her husband, who'd married her for political advancement, found himself managing not a wife, but a psychologically shattered woman who flinched at sudden movements and couldn't bear to be touched unexpectedly. The generation after Xerxes inherited an empire that looked magnificent from the outside cities of unprecedented grandeur. Roads connecting distant provinces, a bureaucracy that administered millions but was rotting from within. The aristocracy was riddled with families carrying the psychological consequences of royal abuse. Trust, loyalty, and basic human bonds had been systematically destroyed in the name of divine kingship. When Alexander the Great invaded in 334 BCE, he defeated not just an army, but a civilization that had already collapsed internally. The archaeological record preserves haunting traces of these women. Administrative tablets from Persepolis mention provisions allocated for royal daughters and residents at remote estates, the ones who'd broken under the war system and been hidden away. Treasury documents record payments to physicians treating unnamed princesses for conditions described in euphemisms that ancient translators struggled with. Religious texts from the period contain prayers that seem to address unnamed suffering, asking Ahura Mazda to grant peace to women of sacred blood who endure trials beyond speaking. What Xerxes did to his daughters was worse than death, because death would have been final. What he inflicted was a living erasure, the systematic destruction of selfhood while keeping the body functioning, useful, deployable. These women survived into their 30s, 40s, some into old age. Carrying trauma that had no name in their language, no framework for understanding or healing. They lived in a world that insisted their suffering was honor, that their exploitation was divine will, that their absolute powerlessness proved the perfection of cosmic order. The cruelest aspect wasn't the abuse itself, as horrific as that was. It was the totality of the system that made escape unthinkable. Every institution, religious, political, social, had bent itself around justifying what was happening. Every person these women might have turned to for help was complicit or powerless, or both. Their own mothers participated in the preparations because refusal meant endangering other children. The priests sanctified it with theology. the nobles benefited from the political marriages that came after. Even the palace slaves and eunuchs, themselves victims of exploitation, became instruments of the system because survival demanded it. This is the part of ancient history that doesn't make it into the triumphal narratives about Persian architecture or administrative genius. The palace complexes we excavate today, marveling at their engineering, those were the same buildings where 12-year-old girls learned that divine bloodlines offered zero protection from predatory power. The cuneiform tablets we translate. Impressed by their bureaucratic sophistication, some of those recorded the logistics of royal abuse. The religious texts we study for their theological insights, those were twisted into justifications for violating the most fundamental human bonds. The last mention of one of Xerxes' daughters in historical records comes from decades after his assassination in 465 BCE. An elderly woman, identified only as royal daughter, resident of the eastern estates, requested permission to dedicate a private shrine. The petition, preserved on a clay tablet, uses formal language but includes one haunting phrase: a place where memory might finally rest. We don't know if permission was granted. We don't know which daughter she was. We only know that 50 years after her father's death, she was still trying to find peace from what he'd done.